welcome. I'm excited to introduce this fifth webinar in the Future of Research series, looking at unlocking the power of unstructured social data. And with so much consumer-generated content from both search and social, this incredibly rich data source has the potential to reveal so much about how people are feeling, what they're doing, and also what they're nervous about or the things that are concerning them. And through this webinar, we'll learn how the use of analytical frameworks embedded in psychology and behavioural science enable us to create structure and insight from an abundance of unstructured data. If you've got questions while you're going through, please put them in the chat because we'll have time for a Q&A at the end of the session. But now what I'd like to do is to introduce two of my colleagues. So we have Felicity Edwards, who's an Associate Director in our Social Intelligence and Analytics team, and Amy Thompson, who's a Director in a Qualitative team, who will be presenting the webinar today. Over to you, Amy.
Thanks, Pippa. So today, as Pippa mentions, we're going to be talking through a bit of a structure of the wonderful world of social data. We'll also be looking at some of the challenges with that as a source of data from an insights perspective. And then we'll move on to think about frameworks as a potential solution to help us find meaning and depth of insight and depth of understanding from the social conversations that we can find. And then we'll follow that with a few practical examples and use cases, so you can see how that might work in practice and a few areas that we can make social conversations turn into insight for us. So the first challenge with social data that you might come across when you first start to think about using it as a source of insight is how overwhelming it can be. To put a few numbers behind that and to give some context, there is, on last count, about 3.7 billion worldwide users of social media. Each of them have about 7.5 accounts each, and there's 10 new social media users every single second of every day, which obviously adds up to a lot of people, but also a lot of content about every single topic imaginable. So while that's an opportunity for us to dig into it and really understand the consumer's perspective, it's also a real challenge in terms of how you wade through that noise. And then the second thing or challenge that we wanted to come to mind when first thinking about social data is really nicely brought to life by an analogy. So I don't know about you guys, I'm sure you spent a bit more time at home this year. And certainly I have, and that has meant my entertainment subscriptions have gone up. So Disney Plus is something that we're trialing in this home at the moment. And I was watching some classic Disney films, Alice in Wonderland being one of those, and realised that there's a really nice analogy in that film for social data. And that is how much it can feel like nonsense. So when you first dip your toe in the world of social data from an insights perspective, you see that there's a lot of contradictory information. So there's a lot of extreme opinion out there. What one person says is right, the other person says is wrong. So it can feel quite contentious. It can feel hard to get to grips with what the truth is. And it can feel quite confusing or overwhelming. Or as Alice would say, it feels a bit like nonsense. So with those two challenges in mind, what we'll be chatting through today is how on earth we discover meaning and real depth of understanding based on social data. I'll now introduce Felicity, my colleague, who will chat us through one potential solution to help us with that.
Now we're trying to start make sense of the journey. Where do we begin? So in the wise words of the King of Hearts, we shall begin at the beginning. So I think really when it comes to social data, we think that there are three real ingredients that you need in place before you start the analysis. So for me, I think that the beauty of social data is that it's already out there, and you just need the right tools and things in place to get to what you need. So to get to your relevant data set. So just like you would design a quant questionnaire or a discussion guide in social, a discussion guide in qual, social has its own guide, and this is in the form of queries. So queries are the things that we process through our social listening tools like Synthesio, which is our in-house social listening tool. And they really work on a keyword matching basis. And the beauty of this is it allows you to hone your scope to be as broad or as narrow as you like, depending on your project. So when we're thinking about Alice, potentially she's looking at all conversations or all social content to do with food, or potentially she's actually more interested in food in the context of a certain tea party. So we have this flexibility, and the queries allow us to get to this level of detail. So make sure you're using a well-constructed query so that you get the relevant data set. The other thing that you'll need, as well as a relevant data set, is a flexible social listening platform. So Synthesio and all of the other market tools available have the ability to add certain levels of filters. So they could be really simple things like countries or language or certain media types, but they get more complex. So some of them allow you to look at the difference between earned and owned social content. And a lot of them have built-in noise reducers as well. And really, this just allows you to narrow and clean that data set even further, so you make sure that what you're looking at is relevant to your use case. So we've got our first two ingredients. We've got the relevant data set and we've got the flexible platform. The third, and I think potentially the most important thing, is having an exploratory mindset. So I think perhaps we're a bit biased being a quali and an ex-quali on the call, but I always think social can be thought of as qual, but at the level of the scale of quant. So the difference really between social and traditional qualitative research is that you have to work that little bit harder to pull the bits together. So for instance, you might start with a signal in social, but then you follow that to see what's happening in search. You might look at the interactions as well, the more passive side of social. You can incorporate other data, so sales data, or even any other kind of existing literature or research in this space. Just like with traditional qual, you make sure you keep going until you can understand the why behind the what. So it really is getting curiouser and curiouser. So now we've got our three key ingredients before we get going into the data. We've got our relevant data set, our flexible platform, and importantly, our exploratory mindset. Where do we go from here? And how do we start to analyse this content in front of us? So to introduce, I guess, the main subject of the webinar, we would suggest considering a framework. So when we look at these definitions, we can see that frameworks are really built on underlying principles. So it might be a system of rules or beliefs that have been built up over time. And the ones that we tend to use in research are based on philosophers and academic research that's been based on years of cultural or kind of philosophical understanding. And really the benefit of this means that there's actually meaning already baked into the frameworks. So once we've got our framework, all we need to do is understand the dimensions and then apply it to the topic at hand. But I think really the key to a good framework is that it needs to be understood by anyone. It needs to be able to turn these kind of complex underlying ideas into layman's terms. Just before I hand back to Amy, though, to take us through an example that we use at Ipsos, I just wanted to think of it in a slightly different way. So I'm going to show you a selection of photos, and I'd like everyone to take, it is an interactive exercise, it's very simple, but I'd like everyone to take a minute just to look at the pictures and start to have a think about what framework or what way of breaking up the data we might apply to the images here. And if you could just type in the chat box, and perhaps Pippa, if you could just read out some of the examples that are coming out, and we can discuss different ways that people are seeing them. So I'll give you a minute to do that. I shouldn't have done this at lunchtime. It's making everyone hungry, probably.
Okay, so we're seeing things like healthy and less healthy, kind of times of day. So breakfast, lunch, perhaps evening meals, and also kind of different types of cuisine. Yep, all really good. So for me, when I look at this, I see breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I can quite clearly see those meal times coming out.
But for other people, those with specialist diets, they might see a vegan diet or a gluten-free, or as you were saying, kind of healthy and unhealthy, right down to macro and micro ingredients. And we can all do this instantly because we have this inherent framework built into our minds based on our life's experience. So I think the key takeout here, though, is that frameworks come in all shapes and sizes, but it's important to pick the one that's most relevant to your business and to your kind of brand needs. So now that we've talked through the general principles that underpin the frameworks, I'm going to hand back to Amy to take us through one of the frameworks that we use most commonly at Ipsos, and she can take you through some of the examples there.
Thanks, Felicity. So as you can tell, we've been practicing these handovers. Hopefully you can see my screen. Felicity, please shout if there's any tech issues. Amazing. So the first example or practical example of social data against a framework is one that's based on our Censydiam framework. So this is something that's been around in Ipsos and probably beyond for quite a while. So when it comes to future research, the framework in itself is not new news necessarily, and you may be familiar with it, but it can be really interesting to apply different types of data to this framework and different types of insights. And we, over the past year or two, have been experimenting quite a lot with social intelligence against this particular framework. So if you're less familiar with it, it is basically there to unpick human motivations, and we can use it when it comes to categories. We can apply segments to it, we can apply brands to it, and so it's quite a flexible tool. And as I say, it can be used with social intelligence, it can be used qualitatively, quantitatively, and everything in between. And to give you a kind of broad overview of how it works, it's based on psychology. So the axis from enjoyment right at the top down to control is all about how we think and perceive ourselves when it comes to thinking about ourselves. So are you drawn to hedonism, or are you all about kind of control and organisation? And that's the first axis to think and keep in mind. And then at that horizontal level, so from power to belonging, it's about who we are when it comes to others. So are we looking to find status, or are we looking for a sense of community or belonging? And then in between all of those, there's a further 4 motivations that help us understand what's going on with people, what's going on with consumers, what's driving them to categories, how brands are communicating. So as I say, lots of different use cases. And when it comes to the example that we wanted to share today, it was actually back in April, looking at the conversation around social distancing and seeing if we could unpick those human motivations in the way people were talking about the new normal that we'd all found ourselves in and still are in to a certain extent. And what we did was map that conversation against the 8 motivations. So to give you a few examples of these, so first of all, thinking about comfort. So this is in a security space. We saw lots of conversation in some qualities of work and also in social intelligence that was showing that people were really drawn to things that felt familiar, that felt nostalgic, that felt really secure and comfortable places to be, whether that was brands or products or behaviour. So this may also account for the fact I was watching classic Disney films quite recently. Another nice example that we saw in the data when we were digging through was this sense of self-improvement. So I don't know about you, but my social media feed has been filled with banana bread and sourdough and taking part in Joe Wicks exercises and all that sort of stuff. And it seemed to us, from what we could gather around the conversation, was that people were finding quite purposeful ways of spending some additional time that they had in their lives and wanted to come out of what we were all experiencing with a sense of purpose and a sense of achievement as well. And then a third example that we identified using the Censydiam framework in social data and in qual was that people still wanted to enjoy themselves. It had gotten a little bit harder, and maybe we were finding joy through some of the smaller things in life, but there was conversation around a really, really good cup of coffee in the morning, or spending a bit more time in nature, or good weather, or spending time with those that you lived with. So all of these things, they may be kind of small things in the grand scheme of things, And even though the rest of the world was quite crazy and complex at the time, it was still a nice chance for us to appreciate the small things in life. And as well as those 3, we also mapped another 5, which I won't talk through, but would be happy to give more information to anyone who's interested in. So thinking back to that wheel that we were just looking at in Censydiam, each of these maps against a different motivation, looking at the social conversation around social distancing. You might be thinking this is very interesting, but what on earth do I do with it? Well, we also looked at what this conversation and what these needs meant for brands and for our clients. So that's the comfort space, that security space that we found. We were telling clients to dial up why consumers know and love the brand. So it might be well-established brands that have been around since childhood, and they really had a sweet spot at that time to remind consumers that they are the kind of familiar, trusted choice. It might be recognition and purpose, and actually brands have a really nice opportunity for creating a sense of accessible achievement when it comes to brand interactions. So that might be online resources, it might be inspiring people to use products in different ways, for example. And then the third example that we had was around joy. So this is particularly important for creative, and it doesn't have to always be entirely kind of negative or cautious. There can also be moments of joy in the way that we talk to consumers. Obviously, it needs to be set into context of the reality we all found ourselves in back in April, but it certainly doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. And alongside those 3 examples, we also had other examples across the full suite of motivations that we dug into. I'm now going to try another seamless handover back to Felicity, who can talk us through another example.
So now Amy's taken us through the motivations that sit underneath the Censydiam framework. I'm going to quickly take you through another framework that we are starting to use more and more when it comes to social data, and that is all to do with behaviour change and understanding certain behaviours that potentially we find slightly obscure. So that is our MAPPs framework, and that was developed by our behavioural science team at Ipsos. So I won't go into too much detail because there was actually an entire webinar dedicated to it, and I think session 2. So we'll make sure that the link is shared to that at the end in case you want more detail on it. But at a very top level, we look at things like, are people motivated to do something? So do they want to do it? We also look at ability. Are they able to do it? Do they have enough knowledge to understand it and to process it properly and make the decision? Is there potentially a physical or social barrier in place to stop a behaviour change from happening? So just to take this back to social data, which is what this is all about, we are going to look at a handful of tweets about wearing or not wearing face masks, just to see how we can start to tie this back to the framework and to the social data. So the first one that we look here is all about the posters' unwillingness to conform to government guidelines. They don't want to be controlled, and this is very much an identity thing for them. So I'm not that kind of person. I don't want to do it. The second one we look at, there appears to be some sort of genuine confusion about the rules around wearing a face mask when it comes to healthcare implications. So there isn't kind of enough knowledge in place for them to be able to process the situation properly. They're not quite sure on what to do. So this would sit in the processing space. And then finally, so when are we allowed to not wear a mask? This is potentially could be around processing, but really it's about routines. So we know that face masks are not quite yet routine. There are still a few kind of teething issues and learnings about when we do and don't wear them. So this is really about routines and the knowledge and the ability. But really, why is this important? So for us, the purpose of it is once you have applied this to the framework, we can really start to get behind just the text that's being said. And once we can understand what's sitting behind that, then we can start to think about targeted strategies to help overcome the barriers and encourage a behaviour change. So it's a slightly different angle to what we've seen with Censydiam, but we've found they're both really, really useful frameworks when it comes to social data. So Now we've gone through the two key frameworks that we use with social at Ipsos. Just thought it would be good to take you through a few examples of the projects and the types of business questions that we can apply these to. So we've used this to help increase market penetration by understanding new market customer targets. We have also helped with increasing purchase frequency by understanding different consumption occasions and different motivations that sit behind them. We have used it in looking at white spaces. So we would look at the needs within a certain category and then overlay where brands sit on each of these needs to see what's being met and where the white spaces are. We've helped with comms work and advertising, and then driving product uptake. And this is actually a project I'm working on at the moment, which I love what we've done here, because what we've done is it's all about the uptake of a certain healthcare product. But with the social data, we've actually used a query to go wider than just a healthcare context and look at parallel decisions that are going on in the lives of these parents. It's a parenting decision. And by going wider than this and applying it to the MAPPs framework, we can understand why this particular healthcare decision that they're trying to make is actually being deprioritized with everything else going on. So it's a really nice example of by getting the scope right and looking at it from different angles, you can actually leverage a lot more insight than just kind of the key business question. And then I think, Amy, you had one that you were going to talk through.
Yes, that's right. So I think for me, my favourite type of social intelligence project is when we get to be a little bit exploratory. So thinking about that frequency example on the slide, we've got something at the moment for an FMCG client looking solely at video data, so primarily YouTube, and exploring a new category using a framework that they already had in the business to really understand what's going on with that category and how the client should enter that category. So we've got a couple of slides to wrap up. The next slide is all about 3 things to keep in mind as kind of final takeaways when thinking about working in social intelligence and particularly with frameworks. So I think the first thing to remember from a qualitative perspective, social data is a hugely interesting source and can actually provide a lot of depth. I think people often think social data and think big data. And that's certainly possible and something that we do when it's relevant, but equally there's a real qualitative opportunity with this source to go beyond just what people are saying and use things like frameworks to get to that underlying mindset and get to the nice juicy why behind the conversation. The second thing to keep in mind is that it's a natural and spontaneous conversation. It's not about getting people in a focus group and prompting them to talk about your brand or your category. So it means you're actively listening into natural conversation and really understanding what they are saying out in the wild about your products or your service or your area of interest. And that has its benefits. Obviously, it's natural conversation, so you get to hear what they really think. But equally, that also means that if you have a very, very specific objective, that can be quite difficult because they may not be talking about your new packaging or the specific thing that you want to find out. And for that reason, it's worth keeping in mind our third rule, which is all about social intelligence not necessarily always being something that you do as a standalone. For certain topics, it certainly can be used on a standalone basis, but for others, it can be very helpful to complement social intelligence with, for example, quantitative work to map out and validate what you found out. Or you can think about additional qualitative work to dig into some of those areas where you couldn't quite get the specifics if the conversation wasn't there. And then to wrap up finally and to bring us back to Alice in Wonderland, it's worth keeping in mind that absolutely social data can feel very overwhelming, and it can feel like there's a lot of contradictory information and a lot of nonsense out there. But hopefully we've shown that there are tools out there, such as frameworks, that can help us find something wonderful in the end. So I'll now ask Pippa to rejoin us, who I believe has been keeping an eye on the questions that have been coming through.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Amy and Felicity. So Flick, if you can switch your camera on, and we'll just have us all on screen. Brilliant. So, thank you for a great introduction to how we can leverage frameworks, and two very different frameworks. But there are others I know that we've used. Clients that we've worked with have their own frameworks, and it's possible to use these kind of tried and tested ways to look at understanding customers, consumers, brands, and so on. So my first question I've got come through, I think probably Flick, this is best for you. Can you apply these frameworks to other types of data?
Yeah, we actually get this question a lot. Yes is the short answer. I think the slightly longer answer is yes, and you should be. I think it becomes a lot more interesting when you've got kind of more data sources. So just like Amy was saying, I guess in traditional research you might have qual and quant, you might have some community, you might have some social. Within just the social space, there's a lot of different data sets that you can use. So I think we touched on them earlier, but things like interactions, things like search data, potentially sales data as well. So we've got teams and kind of specialists across the business that can help us analyze those, and then obviously our Censydiam experts will help us make sense of them. So yes, definitely we can, and I think we should be. I think.
Brilliant. And sorry, Flick.
I was going to say, I hope that answers the question, but.
Cool. Well, I'll look out and see if there's a response to that. Another question, and this is actually something I've also heard myself, is, and Amy, perhaps more from a core perspective, what about small volumes of, if you've only got very small volumes of data?
Yeah, absolutely. As I said before, I think people think social intelligence and think hundreds of thousands of posts. But actually, when you're trying to get to the depth, it can actually sometimes be quite helpful to have a smaller pool, because then you really get to get human eyes across all of it. And so absolutely, I think this sort of work, we can use lots and lots of data, and we can use text analytics to help us really map what that conversation looks like, and then do some poll against some of the topics that have been identified. But equally, if we quite often do work when there's just a kind of few hundred posts about a brand or a competitor or a particular topic, or a marketing activation, for example, and because there's quite a small number, then you can do it in a very human way, get as much richness from it as possible. And if you need a bit more to learn a bit more, then you can always do things like expanding the date range, so not just looking at the past year, but past 2 years, for example. Or if it's, for example, you might look at a brand, but then you might dip into the category conversation as well, to get a bit more information and supplement it that way.
Cool. And that kind of links to another question. We've talked at a very top line level in this seminar about what we're doing, but what's the actual process of analysing against a framework? Flick, I don't know whether, is that one for you or Amy? Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I can take that, and maybe Amy jump in. We've both done, quite a lot of this. So I think I think it always, I would say this as a quality, I think both as qualities, there's the best thing that you can do is just to spend some time with the data and start reading through. I always would begin doing a kind of process manual behaviour, just so that you can start to understand it. Then I guess it depends on the business need, and depends whether you need the numbers behind it, because we've got tools in place that can allow you, so we are our kind of data science teams and some of our AI tools to help you categorize up the content and quantify it as well. So it's the classic kind of human and AI touch, I would say. So it depends on your needs. Sometimes you only need qualitative outputs, just if you want some general themes, but certainly if you do need the numbers behind it, there's tools that we can use. Amy, I don't know if you've got anything else to add.
Yeah, totally. I think that tends to be kind of two routes, and we sometimes do a bit of both in a project. So the text analytics route is where we feed all of the relevant data into machine learning, which I'm definitely not the expert about, but what that does is it groups common language together and helps you find really interesting themes. If there's a conversation up here that is about A and it's this size, there's a conversation over here about B and it's this size. And then from a qualitative perspective, if we've done that, then that gives us the map of the data, if you like, and we can dig into those interesting themes to understand the kind of quality of the conversation going on. If we're not doing that because of the size of the conversation, or it's just a qualitative job, then it's treating social data a bit like a really weird qualitative transcript. So you read through as much data kind of as you can in as much time as you've got, and you're using the filtering tools that like mentioned right at the start of the webinar, that if you find something interesting about a particular word or theme, then you can filter all that data that you have in and address specifically a theme that you think is emerging, and filter the data so you're only looking at content around that. So it can be a bit of a hands-on job, but that tends to be the way to get the richness out of it.
Brilliant. I've got another question here. Now, we know this is a challenge ourselves. Assuming you cannot access Facebook private content, what do you think is being missed or not being able to see that? Or do you feel other sources plug the gap? And if so, which ones?
There's silence because I'll give my perspective.
We get this a lot.
Perspective as well. I think, yeah, we've absolutely got to respect the kind of privacy settings of social media platforms, and so I guess there's a lot of different things you get from different platforms. I think we do get some information from Facebook, and where we don't, we see what other sources are available. So if it's something that we know is going to be a very visual or video based conversation, then there's obviously YouTube and Twitter and so on. If it's a conversation that's happening in different markets, then we pull in the relevant social platforms for those markets. And there's also interesting sources that we plug in that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So things like forums, and that can be kind of general conversation forums like Reddit, for example, or it can be specific interest things like Mumsnet and car forums and all sorts of things. So yeah, absolutely. Obviously, if the conversation is private, then we're not going to get access to it. But there are so many other sources that you don't necessarily think of when you think of social data that we quite often are able to find a relevant conversation, even if it's not the exact Facebook conversation. Felicity, I'm sure you have something to vote on for that as well.
Yeah, no, it was exactly that. I think just when it comes to social data and thinking about different sources is acknowledging the fact before you start that people use the different sources in different ways as well. So the sources aren't the same, and you do need to have some kind of understanding and experience that the way and the language and the way in which people use them is going to be different. So you go in with a different lens, and you can't, therefore, yes, potentially some bits from Facebook are missing, but actually you have so many different angles from lots of different sources that you have overcome that. You go into it knowing that, I think, to some extent. So yeah, it's part of the analyst's job to manage that.
Brilliant. I think we've got time for one final question. Have you ever activated audiences segments found from social research?
Yeah, I'll take this one if you want, Amy. So we do, or Synthesio has a, which is our social listening tool. So it's an Ipsos Synthesio company, and it has a kind of sub tool called Profiler, and that allows us to kind of identify certain audiences based on, but it's more based on behavioural data than social data itself. So there is that tool in place that allows us to identify them, and then we can also kind of tie that back to social data and look at the different, from more of a social content. You can also start to identify sort of different clusters, but it depends on the needs. Anything else?
And I was going to say, we've got a webinar in the November session which pulls a little bit on that about profiling and identifying segments. So do look out for the November webinars, because there's definitely a session looking at search and social around that. Brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much. Some tricky questions there as well for you, Felicity and Amy. I just want to finish by thanking all of you online for joining us. We have 3 more webinars this week, one on Tuesday, one on Wednesday, one on Thursday, which are looking at capturing and activating the moments that matter most. So making sure that we're uncovering those insight gems in the moments when those behaviours actually occur. We've got a session then on Wednesday looking at Agile, which is about more haste, less speed. And then on Thursday, we've got a session looking at creation and creativity. So making sure that we're getting the return on the research investment that we're all making. So you could go back and look at the September recordings. So there's a link that I can see has been put in the chat. So it's futureresearch.ipsos.com. So all of the September recordings are on there, and the October ones will be on there in another week or so. We hope you've enjoyed it, and please do join us on a future webinar. Thank you.